Picture this for a moment. You sit down at your desk with a clear intention. Maybe you're about to start writing something important, solving a problem that requires real thought, or working on a project you've been promising yourself you'd finally make progress on. The plan is simple. Focus for a while, move the work forward, feel that quiet satisfaction of doing something that actually matters. But within minutes, something shifts. A notification flashes, a thought pops up in your mind. Maybe you check one message just quickly. Then another tab opens. Then another video appears that you never searched for but somehow feels impossible to ignore. 20 minutes pass, maybe 30, and suddenly you realize you've drifted somewhere far away from the work you intended to do. And the worst part isn't even the distraction itself. It's the feeling that comes afterward. That quiet frustration, that thought creeping into your mind. Why can't I focus like I used to? What's wrong with me? If you've ever felt that, I want you to hear this clearly. There is nothing wrong with you. You are not broken. You are not weak. And you do not have some permanently damaged attention span. What you're experiencing is something far more ordinary and far more dangerous at the same time. You are living in a world that is constantly competing for your attention. Every app you open, every notification that lights up your screen, every endless scroll of content was designed by teams of engineers and behavioral scientists whose entire job is to keep you engaged for as long as possible. Their success is measured in seconds of your attention, and they have spent years refining systems that are incredibly good at capturing it. Now think about what you're asking your brain to do. You're trying to concentrate in an environment that was literally engineered to prevent concentration. And you're often trying to win that battle with nothing but willpower. No wonder it feels difficult, but here is the part that changes everything. Focus is not a personality trait. It is not something a few lucky people were born with while the rest of us struggle. Focus is a skill, and like every skill, it can be trained. The ancient Stoics understood this long before smartphones, algorithms, or social media existed. The Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius once wrote a reminder to himself that still feels surprisingly modern. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. Even a man responsible for ruling an empire had to fight daily to protect his own attention. Before we go deeper into this, take a second to subscribe to the channel. If you're interested in building a calmer, sharper mind using principles drawn from Stoic philosophy and modern psychology, this channel is for you. In this video, we're going to explore 6 principles that completely change how you understand focus. These are not productivity tricks or quick hacks. They are deeper rules that shape how your brain interacts with the modern world. And once you understand them, something interesting begins to happen. Instead of feeling like your attention is constantly slipping away, you start learning how to direct it. And that process begins with the first realization most people never consider. The problem is not that your brain is failing you. The real problem is that your environment has been training it to fail. Once you understand that your attention is under constant pressure, the next realization becomes impossible to ignore. Most people think focus is a matter of discipline. They believe the real problem is simply not trying hard enough. If they could just develop stronger willpower, if they could just be more focused, everything would improve. But this assumption hides a deeper truth. Your brain is not the enemy in this struggle. Your environment is. The human brain evolved to notice change, movement, novelty, unexpected signals. These were once essential for survival. Thousands of years ago, the ability to detect a sudden sound or movement in the environment could mean the difference between life and death. That ancient alert system still exists inside your mind today. The problem is that the world around you has changed dramatically, but your brain has not. Every notification sound, every flashing icon, every new piece of information appearing on a screen triggers that same ancient system. Your brain interprets it as something potentially important, something worth checking immediately. And when these signals appear dozens or even hundreds of times throughout a day, your attention is constantly pulled away from whatever you were trying to focus on. From the outside, it looks like distraction. From the inside, your brain is simply doing what it was designed to do. This is why willpower alone rarely solves the problem. If your environment is constantly feeding your mind signals of novelty and urgency, your brain will continue responding to them automatically. Fighting that system with pure discipline is like trying to hold a door shut while someone on the other side keeps pushing harder. The Stoics understood this dynamic in a different language. The philosopher Epictetus often reminded his students that the mind becomes shaped by what it repeatedly encounters. If you allow external influences to dominate your attention, those influences begin to control your internal state as well. In other words, your surroundings quietly train your mind every day. Think about something simple. Imagine sitting down to work while your phone rests directly beside your keyboard. Even if you promise yourself you will not touch it, part of your attention is still tied to its presence. A small portion of your mind remains alert, waiting for the next vibration or message. Now move that phone into another room. Suddenly something changes. The pull weakens. The mental noise decreases. Your attention begins settling more naturally into the task in front of you. Nothing about your intelligence changed. Nothing about your motivation changed. Only the environment changed. This is why designing your environment is one of the most powerful actions you can take if you want to improve focus. Remove what constantly pulls your attention away. Close the unnecessary tabs. Silence the alerts that do not actually matter. Create a physical space where your brain receives fewer signals competing for its attention. The Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius often wrote about guarding the mind against unnecessary disturbance. Even in a palace filled with politics, conversation, and distraction, he reminded himself to protect the clarity of his thoughts. Today, that principle applies more than ever. Your environment is quietly shaping your habits of attention every day. If that environment is filled with endless signals demanding your awareness, your focus will always struggle. But when you begin shaping the environment intentionally, something powerful happens. The battle for your attention becomes much easier to win. And once your environment stops constantly pulling your mind in different directions, another hidden problem begins to reveal itself. The myth that we can divide our attention across many tasks and still perform well. That myth has a name: multitasking. Once people begin improving their environment, they often expect their focus to improve immediately. But then another problem appears, one that quietly undermines attention even when distractions are reduced. It's the belief that we can do several things at once and still perform well. For years, multitasking was celebrated as a sign of efficiency. Job descriptions praised it. Productivity culture glorified it. People proudly described themselves as someone who could handle multiple tasks at the same time. It sounded impressive. But there's a problem. The human brain does not actually multitask. What it does is something far less efficient. It switches rapidly between tasks. Each time you move your attention from one activity to another, checking a message, replying to an email, returning to your work, glancing at another tab, your brain must disengage from one mental context and rebuild another. That transition takes energy. It takes time. And most importantly, it disrupts the deep mental state required for serious thinking. At first, these switches feel small. Just a quick glance, just a moment to respond. But over the course of a day, those tiny interruptions accumulate into something much larger. Your attention becomes fragmented. Instead of entering a deep state of concentration, your mind stays near the surface, constantly shifting between different streams of information. The work may continue moving forward, but it moves slowly and unevenly. You remain busy, yet the sense of real progress never fully arrives. This is why many people end a workday feeling exhausted but strangely unsatisfied. They spent hours working, yet the most meaningful tasks somehow remain unfinished. The Stoics understood the importance of undivided attention long before modern neuroscience explained it. The Roman philosopher Seneca warned that people waste much of their lives by scattering their efforts across too many pursuits. In his writings, he repeatedly emphasized that a divided mind cannot produce great work. Depth requires unity of attention. When your focus is directed toward one clear objective, the mind begins operating differently. Ideas connect more easily. Patterns become visible. Problems that once felt complicated start revealing their structure. The longer you remain with a task, the more fully your mind engages with it. This is where real value is created. Think about the moments in your life when you produced work you were genuinely proud of. Perhaps it was writing something meaningful, solving a difficult problem, or building something that required patience and creativity. Those moments almost certainly did not occur while you were constantly switching between messages, notifications, and unrelated tasks. They happened when your attention became fully absorbed. The martial artist and philosopher Bruce Lee once described concentration as the root of all higher abilities. Without it, creativity weakens, learning slows, and complex thinking becomes nearly impossible. When attention is fragmented, every other mental skill suffers. This is why singular focus is so powerful. When you choose one task and protect a block of time dedicated solely to that task, something begins to shift. The first few minutes may feel restless. Your mind may attempt to wander toward easier distractions. But if you remain with the work, a transition occurs. Your attention stabilizes, and once that stability appears, progress accelerates. Problems that seem difficult become manageable. Ideas begin flowing more naturally. Instead of feeling scattered, your thinking becomes coherent and deliberate. The challenge, of course, is that the mind does not stay still for long. Even in the most carefully designed environment, your attention will eventually drift. A random thought appears, a memory surfaces, your mind wanders away from the task. Most people interpret this moment as failure, but the Stoics saw it differently, because the real discipline of focus is not preventing the mind from drifting. It is learning how to bring it back. At some point, no matter how well you design your environment, and no matter how committed you are to single task focus, something inevitable will happen. Your mind will wander. It might start with a small thought, something unrelated to the task in front of you. Maybe you suddenly remember an email you forgot to send. Maybe you think about something happening later in the day. Or maybe your mind simply drifts for no clear reason at all. A few seconds pass before you even realize it. And when you do notice, many people respond in one of two ways. Some follow the distraction completely, allowing that single thought to lead to another and another until they are no longer working at all. Others react with frustration. They criticize themselves, thinking, "I can't even focus for 5 minutes." Both reactions miss something important. The wandering itself is not the real problem. The real skill lies in what happens next. More than a century ago, the psychologist William James described this process with remarkable clarity. He wrote that the ability to voluntarily bring a wandering attention back again and again is the very foundation of judgment, character, and will. Not the ability to avoid distraction completely, but the ability to return after noticing it. This idea changes the entire way we think about focus. Instead of seeing distraction as failure, it becomes part of the training. Every time you notice your attention drifting and gently guide it back to the task, you are strengthening the mental muscle responsible for concentration. It is very similar to physical training. When someone lifts weights, each repetition places stress on the muscle, and over time that stress leads to growth. Attention works in much the same way. Each return is a repetition. The Stoics practiced a similar mental discipline. The philosopher Epictetus taught that the mind must be trained with the same patience and consistency used to strengthen the body. Thoughts will appear, impulses will arise, and emotions will sometimes attempt to pull our attention away. But the goal is not to eliminate those experiences. The goal is to develop the ability to respond to them wisely. In practical terms, that means noticing when your attention drifts and calmly guiding it back. No frustration, no self-criticism, just a quiet redirection. This small action may seem almost insignificant in the moment, but repeated over time, it becomes incredibly powerful. 10 returns in a single session are 10 repetitions. Over weeks and months, those repetitions accumulate into a much stronger capacity for sustained focus. What once felt impossible slowly becomes natural. Interestingly, research on attention supports this idea. Studies tracking people throughout the day have found that the human mind spends a surprising amount of time away from whatever activity the person is currently performing. In many cases, nearly half of waking life involves some form of mind wandering, but something else appears in the data. When the mind is disconnected from the present activity, people consistently report feeling less satisfied and less engaged with their experience. Presence matters. The Stoic emperor Marcus Aurelius often reminded himself to return his attention to the present moment, not to worry about past events or future uncertainties, but to focus on the task immediately in front of him. For someone responsible for managing an empire, this practice was not philosophical decoration. It was a survival skill. Your life may look very different from his, but the same principle still applies. The quality of your attention shapes the quality of your experience. When your mind is scattered, your work feels scattered. When your attention returns to the present moment, clarity follows. Tasks become more manageable. Thinking becomes more precise. Even difficult problems begin to feel less overwhelming. But there is another factor that quietly influences this entire process, one that many people overlook when they try to improve their focus. Your mind may be responsible for directing attention, but it does not operate alone. Your ability to concentrate also depends on the condition of something much more physical, your body. Up to this point, we've talked about attention as if it were purely a mental skill, something you train through discipline, awareness, and practice. And while that's partly true, there is another layer that many people overlook. Your mind does not operate separately from your body. The brain that you rely on for concentration, decision-making, creativity, and learning is a physical organ. It consumes energy. It depends on oxygen, blood flow, and a complex balance of chemicals that regulate how alert or fatigued you feel. When those biological systems are functioning well, focus becomes easier. When they are strained or depleted, even the strongest intention struggles to hold attention in place. This is why so many people attempt to solve a focus problem with productivity tools when the real issue is biological. Imagine trying to run demanding software on a computer that hasn't been properly maintained. The processor overheats, the memory slows down, programs begin lagging or crashing altogether. No matter how good the software is, the hardware limits what it can do. The same principle applies to the brain. Sleep is one of the clearest examples. During deep sleep, the brain performs essential maintenance. It clears metabolic waste, strengthens important neural connections, and restores the systems responsible for attention and impulse control. When sleep is consistently shortened, those systems begin to degrade. The result is subtle but powerful. Your reaction time slows. Your ability to filter irrelevant information weakens. Small distractions suddenly feel more tempting. The effort required to stay focused increases dramatically. You might interpret this as a failure of discipline, when in reality, it is simply biology expressing its limits. The Stoics recognized the importance of caring for the body, even while emphasizing mental strength. The philosopher Epictetus once reminded his students that the body is the place where life unfolds. To neglect it while pursuing clarity of mind would be like trying to live inside a house while ignoring the condition of its foundation. Movement plays a similar role. Regular physical activity increases blood flow to the brain, particularly to the regions responsible for executive control and sustained attention. Even moderate exercise, a walk, a short run, or a brief period of movement before a work session can noticeably improve mental clarity. When the body becomes active, the mind often follows. Stress, however, pushes the system in the opposite direction. When stress becomes chronic, the body releases higher levels of cortisol and other stress hormones. These chemicals are useful for short bursts of alertness, but when they remain elevated for long periods, they begin interfering with the brain's ability to maintain calm, focused thought. The mind becomes reactive rather than deliberate. You may notice this when you feel overwhelmed. Tasks that normally feel manageable suddenly seem more complicated. Your attention jumps quickly between different concerns. The desire to escape toward easier distractions grows stronger. In that state, focus becomes extremely difficult. Nutrition also influences this system. The brain requires a steady supply of energy to maintain concentration. Rapid spikes and crashes in blood sugar can lead to cycles of temporary alertness, followed by sudden fatigue, making sustained attention difficult to maintain. None of these factors are glamorous. They are not exciting productivity tricks or clever hacks. They are simply the operating conditions of the mind. When the body is rested, nourished, and regularly active, the brain has the resources it needs to sustain attention. When those conditions deteriorate, the ceiling for focus drops, no matter how determined you feel. This realization can actually be empowering. Instead of blaming yourself for losing concentration, you begin adjusting the conditions that support it. Protect your sleep, move your body regularly, reduce chronic stress where possible. Provide the brain with the steady energy it requires. These actions may appear simple, but their effects accumulate. And when your body begins supporting your focus, instead of quietly undermining it, another important shift becomes possible. Because even with a healthy mind and body, many people still struggle with attention for one simple reason. They are making important decisions at the worst possible moment, in the middle of chaos. Which leads us to the next principle: deciding what matters before the noise of the day begins. Even when your environment improves and your mind becomes stronger at returning to focus, another quiet obstacle often remains. It appears at the very beginning of the day, long before most people realize what is happening. It is the absence of a clear decision. Many people start their mornings with only a vague sense of what they should be doing. They open their laptop, check a few messages, glance at their inbox, maybe scroll briefly through a feed, and before they know it, the direction of their day has already been determined. But not by them, by whatever appeared first. This is one of the most subtle ways attention gets lost. When you begin a day without a defined intention, your brain naturally gravitates toward whatever task feels easiest or most immediately rewarding. Email becomes the default. Messages become the default. Small reactive tasks quietly replace the deeper work you originally hoped to accomplish. The day becomes busy but not necessarily meaningful. Over time, this pattern creates a frustrating experience. Hours are spent responding to things, organizing small details, handling minor requests. Yet the projects that truly matter remain unfinished. The progress you hope to make keeps getting pushed further into the future. This is not a failure of motivation, it is a failure of decision timing. The Stoics believed that preparation is a form of discipline. The philosopher Seneca often wrote about the importance of directing one's energy toward what truly deserves it. Without clear intention, he warned, time disappears into trivial pursuits that feel urgent but produce little lasting value. The solution is surprisingly simple. Make the important decisions before the day begins. When your mind is still calm, either the night before or early in the morning, identify the 1 to 3 tasks that genuinely matter most. Not 10 tasks, not an endless list, but a small number of priorities that, if completed, would move your work or your life forward in a meaningful way. Then assign those tasks to specific periods of time. Instead of saying, "I'll work on this sometime today," create a defined window. From 8 to 9:30, this is the only task that exists. During that period, everything else is closed. Messages wait. Notifications remain silent. The outside world pauses while you give your full attention to the work. This approach changes the entire structure of your day. When the most important decisions are made in advance, your mind no longer wastes energy, constantly choosing what to do next. The path is already clear. All that remains is to follow it. There is also a psychological advantage to this method. The first hours of the day are often when the mind is sharpest and most capable of deep thinking. If those hours are consumed by reactive tasks, responding to messages, checking updates, handling small distractions, you spend your most valuable mental energy on the least meaningful work. By the time you reach the tasks that truly matter, your attention has already been diluted. But when your day begins with a clear intention, something different happens. You enter the work with direction. Momentum builds early. Instead of chasing the day, you begin shaping it. The Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius practiced a similar form of preparation each morning. Before facing the demands of leadership, he would remind himself of the responsibilities ahead and commit his attention to the work required of him. In doing so, he ensured that his focus belonged to his purpose rather than to whatever distractions might appear. And when intention becomes stronger than distraction, your attention begins working in your favor. But even with clear priorities and a well-designed day, there is still one final challenge that modern life rarely allows us to face: the quiet discomfort of boredom. And strangely enough, that discomfort may be one of the most powerful tools for strengthening focus. There is one experience modern life has almost completely eliminated, and without realizing it, we may have lost something important along the way: boredom. Think about how rarely you experience true stillness anymore. The moment a gap appears in your day, you instinctively fill it. Waiting in line, you check your phone. Sitting in traffic, you turn on a podcast. Walking alone, you reach for music or messages. Even the quiet moments before sleep often become another opportunity to scroll through information. Every empty space becomes filled with stimulation. At first, this feels harmless. After all, you are simply staying entertained or informed. But over time, something subtle begins to change. Your brain becomes accustomed to constant input. It begins expecting a steady stream of novelty, reward, and distraction. And when that constant stimulation disappears, your mind reacts. Silence starts to feel uncomfortable. This is why many people struggle when they attempt to focus deeply. The work itself often unfolds slowly. Meaningful thinking requires patience. Creativity emerges gradually rather than instantly. Compared to the rapid stimulation of digital content, the pace of real work can feel strangely dull. So, the mind begins searching for an escape. Another tab, another notification, another quick distraction. But what feels like relief in the moment actually weakens your capacity for focus over time. The Stoics were familiar with this challenge long before the modern world magnified it. The Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius wrote that nowhere can a person find a quieter or more peaceful retreat than within their own mind. His words suggest something profound. True clarity often appears not in noise, but in silence. To reach that clarity, however, you must be willing to pass through discomfort first. This is what it means to sit in the fire. When you remove constant stimulation, the mind initially resists. Restlessness appears. Thoughts scatter. You may feel an urge to reach for your phone or find something easier to occupy your attention. That urge can feel surprisingly strong, but if you remain with the silence instead of escaping it, something interesting begins to happen. The restlessness fades. Your mind settles gradually like sediment sinking to the bottom of clear water. What felt uncomfortable at first becomes calm. And once that calm appears, a deeper kind of thinking becomes possible. Ideas connect more easily. Insights surface. Problems that once felt confusing begin to organize themselves. This process is not accidental. Neuroscientists studying the brain's default mode network have found that periods of quiet mental rest allow the brain to integrate information, strengthen memory, and generate creative insights. In other words, the mind often does some of its most valuable work during moments that appear inactive. But that process cannot occur if every empty moment is filled with stimulation. The philosopher Epictetus taught that discipline is not only about controlling action, but also about controlling impulse. The impulse to escape discomfort is one of the strongest impulses the mind produces. When you learn to observe that impulse without immediately obeying it, you strengthen your ability to direct your own attention. In a world where most people rush to eliminate boredom as quickly as possible, the person who learns to tolerate stillness gains a powerful advantage. They develop depth of thought, depth of creativity, depth of attention, and depth is becoming increasingly rare because the modern world is filled with tools designed to keep the mind busy but not necessarily focused. Many people spend their days moving rapidly between small pieces of information without ever settling into sustained concentration. But the person who learns to remain with slow, demanding work long enough for their mind to adapt, enters a completely different mental state, a state where focus becomes natural rather than forced. And once you understand this principle, you begin to realize something important. Mastering attention in the modern world is not simply a productivity skill, it is a form of personal power. By now, a pattern should be starting to emerge. Each principle we explored is not just a productivity trick or a temporary strategy. Together, they reveal something much deeper about the modern world and about the role attention plays in shaping our lives. Your environment influences where your mind goes. Your habits determine how often it drifts. Your body sets the limits of your mental energy. Your decisions shape how your time is used, and your ability to remain present, even when things feel slow or uncomfortable, determines how deeply you can think. All of these forces converge in one simple reality. Attention is power. The Stoics understood this long before the world became saturated with constant distraction. The philosopher Marcus Aurelius believed that the quality of a person's life is largely determined by the quality of their thoughts. But thoughts themselves depend on attention. If your attention is scattered, your thinking becomes scattered. If your attention is steady, clarity begins to appear. In other words, where your attention goes, your life follows. This is why mastering attention has become one of the most valuable skills in the modern world. Today, your attention is constantly being requested, pulled, and redirected by systems designed to keep you engaged. The longer you remain inside those systems, the harder it becomes to focus on your own priorities. But the moment you begin reclaiming control over your attention, something powerful happens. You start directing your life again. Instead of reacting to whatever appears in front of you, you choose what deserves your focus. You decide what problems are worth solving. You determine which goals receive your energy. That shift may seem subtle at first, but over time it changes everything. Progress compounds. One focused hour leads to meaningful work. Meaningful work builds confidence. Confidence encourages deeper effort. Day by day, the results accumulate. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus often reminded his students that freedom begins when a person learns to govern their own mind, not the outside world, not the unpredictable events of life, but the inner space where attention is directed and choices are made. That inner mastery is what these principles are ultimately about. You do not need to implement everything perfectly tomorrow. Real change rarely happens through dramatic transformation. Instead, it grows quietly through consistent practice. Choose one principle that resonated with you most strongly. Apply it for the next 2 weeks. Observe how your attention behaves. Notice how your work begins to feel different. Then add the next principle. Over time, those small adjustments reshape your habits. Your mind becomes steadier. Your ability to concentrate grows stronger. What once felt difficult begins to feel natural. And in a world where most people are constantly distracted, the person who can sustain attention has an extraordinary advantage. Not because they work longer hours, not because they are inherently more talented, but because when they sit down to do something important, they are actually there, fully present, fully engaged, fully capable of bringing their best thinking to the task. If this perspective resonated with you, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Each video here explores practical ways to strengthen your mind, sharpen your focus, and apply timeless Stoic ideas to modern life. And if you want to go even deeper, there's another video on your screen right now that explores a powerful Stoic principle for building unshakable discipline. Click on it and continue the journey. Because mastering attention isn't a one-time decision, it's a daily practice. And the more you practice it, the stronger and freer your mind becomes.